Hello, everyone. We have a special discussion today, and we have Kanchi Kohli with us, and many of you would have read her articles, would have seen her on television. Kanchi Kohli is a senior researcher at CPR, and she's been writing on issues of law, governance, industrialization, the impact that all of this has on ideas of equity and justice for many, many years. And our today's discussion actually is broadly around law and governance and looking at how do we actually bridge the gap between law and governance in many, many ways, and also to deconstruct some of these things, because a lot of times we think that it's too heavy. The word law is scary. The word governance is extremely complicated and complex, and many citizens don't want to get into it. So good morning, Kanchi. Thanks for agreeing to be part of this discussion. And I should also tell you that Kanchi and Manju, they're actually authoring a book which addresses similar questions or similar issues that we're going to talk about today. So we look forward to this book once it comes, Kanchi, and we keep reading your articles and your bylines everywhere.
Thanks.
So today, Kanchi, the first question that we wanted to ask you is that, just to give a historical and philosophical perspective on law and governance, because, a lot of times we think that it's all new. It's all, some people think that it's all new in terms of this entire activism. And some people also think that our laws are outdated. But just to give us a perspective, a historical and philosophical perspective on law and governance in India, let's begin with that.
I think a lot of what we are going to be, with respect to law, I think looking at how laws itself have evolved and how it has a very strong connection also with how our understanding of environment has evolved. So in the 1960s and 1970s, the larger persuasions were about wild spaces, wildlife legislations, or about clean air. So, some of the, even at the international level, some of the earliest laws were about these kinds of issues. Gradually, laws also started speaking about how to deal with regulating resources like forests or water and those kinds of natural resources. But I think what is interesting now, what we're seeing is the post-90s era, where you have a whole bunch of executive-led legislation. So there's a master legislation by, say, the Parliament, the Environment Protection Act, but its entire implementation and enforcement is through a lot of executive orders, notifications, subordinate legislations, like environment impact assessments, coastal regulation zone. So I think law regulations, so all of these are more regulatory in nature, where what they're trying to mainly do is when governments have introduced things like developmental projects or industrial and infrastructure projects, how do you actually ensure that they do keep environment and sustainability in the manner in which they are designed and implemented? So at project level, these regulations were introduced in countries like India, as is with across the world in the early 90s.
So Kanchi, a lot of our time over decades have been spent fighting for newer laws or better laws, and also in terms of execution of those laws on the ground. So we've found some laws being not so right. But if you take a few steps back and just begin our discussion saying that, is there anything right about our laws in our country? So in the sense, we of course criticize our laws and the enforcement of the law, but what's exciting about this landscape, the Indian law landscape vis-a-vis environment and sustainability, if you could share with our viewers?
So I think the very fact that governments across the world, and including India, have acknowledged that environment is an issue that you need to tackle with upfront, I think that itself is a gain. And it was a gain out of a lot of social movements. It was a gain for lots of environmentalists who've been raising fundamental issues. But it also was a response of industry, which actually realized that you could not proceed with your investments, unless and until you build in this narrative into your investment. Now, of course, it's a different story in terms of how it has gotten enforced. It's a different story in terms of when you actually look at eventually how the laws were framed and amended over a period of time, what they became. So, many laws often have been spoken about as, and we've tried to write about it as well, is that they are almost failure by design. The ultimate outcome of that legislation is actually, or that law is actually to give an approval. It's not an ethic to uphold environmental sustainability or conservation or people's livelihoods, or it's not necessarily directed at ensuring environment and social justice. It's a very linear legislation which eventually is going to result in a government decision on yes and no. But as I said, it's the very fact that these laws are in place means that governments as well as industry cannot, or even private individuals cannot ignore the fact that environment is an aspect you need to deal with when you're planning every step of your life, or every step of your business.
Absolutely. So what you're saying is that ideally laws of our country act as a big deterrent, or ideally it should act as a deterrent for individuals, institutions, corporations, or the state itself in that sense. Given that, of course, as in we've seen that it's not, as in people have found ways or highways around these laws to really find an excuse to really trespass it or to overrule it in that sense. Given that context, how do you see India's environment? In the sense, you've been actually not just the laws of India vis-a-vis environment, but also you've been a commentator on several of these environmental issues for several decades now. Where is India right now? As in, is it getting better? Is it getting worse vis-a-vis India's environment? Several studies, of course, there's a lot of grandstanding around air, for example. Some of the state governments say, oh, well, we've become better than what we were 10 decades ago. Some of our governments and government agencies say that we've become greener than what we were 20 years or 30 years ago. Now that's on, one side we have this data coming from, from the state itself. And of course, we also have a data like the Lancet report that came, for example, yesterday, or several of these reports that's been coming looking at the impact of environment on human health, public health, and on our economy. So where are we? Are we in a good position? Do we need to get better? Or is it just a smoke screen? Is it just a farce to just say, oh, we are all good and we don't need to do more?
I think, what you laid out, Nidhu, is actually very, very a persuasive sort of set of points that make not just all of us, but I think should push governments to rethink both the environmental question in India as well as the legal landscape around environment. Because I think some of the questions like food security, public health, which are very, very critical to human survival now. Even if you want to look at environment. So one of the biggest questions has been that environment has always seen from an anthropocentric point of view. We always see it from what we need to pull out from the environment rather than, let the environment be. So I think some of these issues, even if you see it from the public health and food security point of view, we have to re-envision our environmental legal landscape to be able to respond to some of those questions. And I think from that point of view, both the environment as well as environmental law, what we are really seeing is a marginalization of the environment and a marginalization of the environmental law. Because for governments, upholding the environmental question is often seen as, can be seen as, as a hindrance to growth, or it's seen as a, roadblock in development. Whereas, so it's not seen as a positive value that one needs to build into the development space. At the same time, when you see the implementation of environmental laws, or you see the placement of environmental laws in governmental decisions, they come far downstream into the process of deciding what needs to be done. So for instance, an area is already declared as an infrastructure corridor way before you've actually decided to apply environmental laws on it, or environmental assessments on it. So the viability question sees environmental laws much lower down in the decision making sphere. So I think this is a very important point, whether it's from the air pollution point of or the contamination and depletion of water, or very fundamental questions that each one of us is raising on a regular basis, including you, Bimlindu, on television on every year after year, is that, how is it that these laws can actually respond for the government to really deal with issues of health, food security, livelihoods. So those are often not seen very much part of how we perceive spaces, and what we see needs to be. So what we need to see is maximized. At max, what the government start trying to do is to say, okay, you raise an environmental question, we'll respond to the environmental question by offsetting the loss or compensating for damage. So it's not held upfront, or it's not given the higher regard that it requires.
Sure. So the way I understand this, what you've just said, and the previous questions as well. So we actually have the political class, or say the legislature, formulating some of these laws, and through shortcut or long cut in that sense. We have the executive that is supposed to be transacting these laws on the ground. There's judiciary, which is supposed to act as a check and balance, or to make sure that there's no bias, or there's no ulterior agenda behind some of these laws, and those laws are actually transacted on ground in its spirit. And then we have the citizens, who a lot of times are facing the impact of bad execution, or sometimes are the violators of many of these laws as well. Now, given the landscape, if we really need to fix some of these things, we know that if we were actually doing everything all right, then we would not be where we are today, vis-a-vis air, water, land, forest, biodiversity, flyover, to all kinds of things in that sense. Where is the problem? As in, of course, we are in that season of contempt in that sense, so it's okay, but it's good to have some contempt. But do you think judiciary, which is also, as my first prompt question to you, is that where do you think the role of judiciary is in all of this? Because is it overreacting, underreacting? Is it, if you use the word sold out, is it compromised? Is it very naive? Is it, does the judiciary not have an understanding of something so technical as environment, or something as basic as air and water? Where does our problem lie in this entire, mammoth of stakeholders and heavy duty stakeholders that we actually have?
So I don't think it's a matter of ignorance at all. I think every arm of the government, whether it's every arm of the country which actually is responsible for governance, is very clear about what, it's the environmental question is far more visible. You have people. I mean, the most apex court of the country is located in New Delhi, which is choking all the time. So I think that's. So I don't think it's ignorance at all. I think it's to a large extent it is about. As I was saying, both the environmental question as well as the environmental legal framework comes way down in priority. So, it's almost felt like you can fix the problem. You can fix the problem as long as we get economic supremacy, or we get economic capital in our hands. All of these, there's a scientific fix, there's a ecological fix, there is a livelihood fix. So a lot of it is a after the fact fix that we're talking about. So in fact, if you see, laws lately have largely evolved to build in those aspects. You have a reduced space for public participation and an increased space for offsets. You have even more and more legislations talking about groundwater conservation fee. So it's not about, the law is not going to tell you use less groundwater, but the more you use, the more fee you pay. Or for that matter, it says, okay, it won't tell you don't chop down the forest or don't chop down the trees. When you do it, pay this much and you can do it. So the pay and use which was otherwise an administrative practice, an occasional use that you needed to bring in only when there were no options and alternatives. All this is becoming very much part of environmental law. Now, the judiciary actually comes in with the same priorities. It is looking to fix a problem. It's looking to solve a problem in favor of increasing infrastructure and or industrial expansion in the country, and not asking the basic question about which are some of our laws actually ask, what are the alternatives? Like for instance, one very interesting response in a government report, which has yet not reached the judiciary, but one of the was that why do you need to open this coal mine in the central Indian forest, the jungle bookland? Why do you want to open up those those areas like that? So the response of the government officer, the forest officer, was that there is no alternative to coal. Yeah. So the counter question that you might want to ask is, what about an alternative to the forest? What is about the alternative to water? What about the alternatives to the the people living and all the livelihoods that are dependent on these areas? So I think the every arm of the government, and judiciary included, is very much coming with that persuasion. So even when you find something that is a violation, that violation has to be fixed, rather than fixing liability and responsibility on the perpetrator of the offense.
Absolutely. So, India's environmental principles or philosophy actually was based on precaution or caution. It wasn't about damage and then fix in that sense. And somewhere when we see judiciary also departing from that basic foundation of our sustainability or environmental practice, and we've seen how judiciary, as you rightly said, given examples that it discusses compensatory afforestation more than that. Why do we even need to cut that forest in that sense? And that's a departure from the basic principle of sustainability in that sense. And that's somewhere we feel that it's unfortunate, and our judiciary should be more proactive and also take a few steps back in that sense. But also in some of these issues, do we feel that what's your opinion, that do we feel that judiciary should not get involved? Because a lot of times we feel that judiciary does more damage because it's the last word in that sense. Like the example of smog towers, for example. That when a Supreme Court judge says that install smog towers, there's no need for any research or any. It almost says that that's the last word on how to fix your air, or for that matter, on issues of stubble burning, how we've seen year after year, government actually, come up with some, as in the courts actually reprimanding some stakeholder or the other, but not penalizing anybody ever, or the executive in that sense. So where's do you think there's a problem there as well, that judiciary gets over involved in matters of executive that actually in the long run damages the administrative capacity of the executive?
So I think the judiciary is definitely getting involved because there's a need to get involved. So either there is executive action that has failed, or so there is always a space for the judiciary to get involved. So, and it might happen either through some citizens groups actually approaching the judiciary, or suo moto, which has been with the air pollution issue. I think there's been a lot of suo moto action by the judiciary. So rather than actually going into whether the judiciary should get involved or not, because I think it is the mandate of the judiciary, when somebody is approaching the judiciary or there's a problem that might come to your notice, to actually get involved. The larger question is, if you get involved in the question, what is the process through which you're actually looking to address that question? So if you're looking at a legal violation, is it just between you and the government that you're actually taking a decision in terms of, or it's a pick and choose about which studies you rely on, which you don't? So if you've taken suo moto cognizance of a public issue, it's highly crucial that the public is equally involved. And when I say public, it's not about select set of public, but you actually can put in place processes by which there is this public inputs, public engagement, different kinds of suggestions come in, and only then look at whether smog towers is the answer or something else is the answer. So it's like, let's not preempt the solution at the time we are taking on a question, whether as part of the government, the parliament or the executive parliament or the judiciary. So I think what we are really missing is our the process through which you arrive at a solution, or or what you want to do about a problem. Because the problem, because I think, we all, if you only approach this as a highly scientific, technical, or a highly techno legal issue, and not a social issue, or not a justice issue, then these kinds of solutions, quick fixes, are the ones which will be in front of you. So there's much more deeper engagement, I think, each of these institutions, and it's very much possible. I mean, there are globally examples on which you could put in place deliberative processes. You can put in place community monitoring efforts by which you could arrive at very interesting responses to how to address these issues, and you might find much better outcomes than what we see today.
Kanchi, you've done some phenomenal work in explaining some of these laws to the citizens, and through your writings, through your work on the ground, through several campaigns that you've actively engaged yourself. So you've not just been an armchair writer and an opinion, giving person. You've also involved yourself in some of these campaigns and movements in that sense. What's been your experience? If you could just share with our viewers that what does it actually take to really have that one eye on the ground and the other on this loaded law and governance aspect of things? Because you've actually done that balance very well, that you've not just been a romantic savior of the environment, of our trees, of our forest, of our ecology, but also kept that other researcher hat. And how has that been last 2-3 decades that you've actually been doing this?
It's very kind of you. I'm like now floating. Thanks, Vimlendu. I think, see, one of the things that persuaded all of us who actually took to reading the law not as part of a course curriculum, or it came to us when we were trying to work in contexts where both the environment, or both the ecology, or rather the biodiversity ecology, as well as people were threatened to some extent by land use change, water extraction and pollution, all those kinds of things. Yet the knowledge about what is there and what are the procedures that should be followed was completely missing. And it was completely missing because the text of the law never reaches the places that are getting most affected by it. So although government authorities might be, you might need to put in place processes, etc., but whether those processes are correct, incorrect, people getting most affected by these areas, or areas getting most affected by these decisions, are actually never aware. And they're not aware because of two reasons. A, there's not been a proactive way in which governments have made the legislation reach there. Sometimes, even if a text of law reaches some of these places, the language is so, it's highly I won't even say it's technical. It's by design, or it's by, meant to alienate people, because the way it is drafted, the formats, that's not how people really understand these, their places, or how it's almost like every document like that is meant to actually get an adverse reaction, from people, then to say, okay, this is not for us, or at max, we have to go to a lawyer to actually solve this question. So what we've tried to do is to really see that a lot of time people affected or interested in these the environmental questions, or questions in their area, or issues in their area, whether they can directly link it to what is there in the text of law, and whether that changes the power dynamics in which you actually even approach and talk about this. So something that is an impact, is whether it is a permissible impact or an illegal impact, that makes a huge difference in which how you would approach anybody, whether it's the industry in your neighborhood, whether it's the government authority who might not let you in, or any of those. So in many ways, it's both making the text reach the place as well as the language. So sometimes you have to completely change the language and use movie dialogues, to actually try and explain some of these the legal text to people, and then it's picked up. And one would see the number of people who are interested in it, who actually are able to use it to get very specific systematic remedies for problems that might have persisted for years. Simple things like having a safety wall around an industry, a green belt, a very low hanging fruit in many ways. Even those basic compliances were not there. So I think it's very crucial to work with people, and you can see the excitement of understanding the law and breaking down the law in and seeing the possibilities in law. So you can, some of us might be very cynical about the text of the law, but when you talk to people who are most affected by problems, they see possibilities, and when they see possibilities, you are almost encouraged to use and change laws yourself. That's what it is.
I have two more questions, and the second last question is that you've been teaching at several universities for many years. You've been taking lectures and classes. Do you think it should be mandatory for our bureaucrats and for our judges to undergo a course on law and governance? Because we often have seen that the biggest violator is the state. A lot of times it's the myopic understanding of sustainability that our judges have and our bureaucrats have. So do you think it should, are you exploring a possibility of filing a PIL or something to make sure that all the bureaucrats and judges should get a crash course on why is it important to really have ecology more important than economy in that sense?
So definitely, I'm not filing any PIs. But see, your point about going through these courses, I think lots of law schools, institutions like the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, audit institutions like the CAG, they have regular refresher courses where laws are, I mean, it's not enough. To answer your question, there definitely could be much more introduction or refresher courses for almost every part of the government, and many courses where government and citizens sit together and deal with some of these legal questions, because how you might approach it from taking a government decision point of view, or when you're approaching it from a citizen's point of view, it might be different. So it might be very interesting to actually design courses to bring these the sets of people together. But I think, so there have been regularly, there are courses, refresher courses for forest department all the time. The question is, how is it? So one is, of course, how you design it, and when you can bring in that variety in that course curriculum itself. But I think at the same time, how does one even prioritize these questions? So other than just the text of law, what it says, how do you actually prioritize these questions when you're taking a decision? I think is a very important question for many government officials as well, because sometimes you might want to do something, but could be other persuasions that might not allow you to do it. And in situations like that, I think having classroom exercises to be able to do, how do you apply some of these things, so to where you uphold the environmental justice question much higher up, will be very crucial. But this cannot go very far unless and until the government's intent backs it. So you need to enable government officials to be able to take decisions.
I remember when we were all growing up, we had this subject called civics. And I don't know which year was this textbook or this subject taken off our course curriculum in that sense. And sometimes I imagine that perhaps there should be something like civics, or as a part of civics, these laws taught in our schools to young children, for them to understand that this is not something which you are asking extra. It's your right and it's your duty, and you need to know about it, because a lot of people don't even know that it's it's a fundamental responsibility of the state or of that citizen to really behave in a particular way. Now, the last question to you is about Environment Impact Assessment Draft 2020. How do you see this? Because this, a lot of commentators, environmentalists have actually said and shared their anxiety that this is going to change the way we look at environment, the way we look at environmental governance, and the way we look at environmental law itself. And it's going to set a very, very dangerous precedent in that sense. What's your understanding? What's your feeling? What's your anxiety?
See, the EIA process across the globe, including in India, was never introduced to hold back development or hold back infrastructure projects. It was always seen as a partner law or package law that was introduced to say that when you are doing in industrial infrastructure expansion, you also need to bring in environment impact assessments, public participation. All of that persuasions did come in. Now, the anxiety and the very right apprehension and very right kind of analysis that has been put out is that consistently EIA processes have been read down, and or other, as simply people will talk about, diluted. So legally you'll say read down, but you'll say simply you'll say it's been diluted in favor of enabling project developers much more than looking at environmental justice questions. So it's critical. Why this question is critical? For 3 or 4 reasons. Throughout the text, so it's been gradually happening, and this is one of the biggest changes that you're seeing since 2006 when the law was last amended. So there are 3 or 4 very critical things that are happening. One, as you yourself said, the question of precaution, which was very much part in the design of the environment impact assessment, that itself is changing. So basically, there is a something that was an administrative practice to allow for a industry that has violated environmental law to come and take post facto, or the violation could be condoned. That becomes part of the text of the law. So when you actually make it part of the text of the law, you normalize what is happening with violations. You can continuously violate and continuously come and say sorry. So I think people are enraged by that particular issue. Throughout the text of the law, opportunities for public participation have been constantly reduced. So these are very important questions for people. Most, not just people across the country who are basically asking the bar for environmental justice to be much higher. And here you see the trend going completely in the opposite direction. So where do you actually bring these two conversations together? It becomes a big challenge. And I think that's why there has been an enraged, particularly that this is being introduced during a pandemic, where people, even they want to raise a question, they're not being able. So both procedurally and substantively, there are lots of questions around the EIA.
Absolutely, Kanchi. So we've looked at how COVID-19 ideally should have triggered a different kind of a normal. And that's what many countries have actually been talking about. And here we are taking 20 million steps back, rather than actually imagining a regime or landscape that really brings public health and public ecology in the center of the debate. We're actually throwing it out in many, many ways. Thank you, Kanchi, for speaking to us. It's been an amazing conversation. Keep doing what you're doing. And I think it's times like these that we need conversations on resilience, conversations around informed citizenry, informed decision-making, something which is not based on short-term gain, but long-term, air and breath and water and forest. And not just because we want a good Instagram photo of a blue sky and a blue river, but because we need a better lung. So thanks a lot again for talking to us.